1967, we were building our forces up in Vietnam, and so the peak of our forces, American forces in Vietnam, was 1968. The year I was there all of 1968. My brother Tom was there with me 10 of those months. We had 550,000 troops in Vietnam, and most people who don't know much about the Vietnam War find that hard to believe. 1968 was the worst year. We had, I think, around 16,000 or more killed in action, casualties, Americans killed in action in 1 year. Obviously, tens of thousands of young Americans wounded. 1968 was a terrible year all around because in the United States, we were going through the King assassination, the Kennedy assassination, the burning of cities, the Chicago Democratic Convention, the riots. The Vietnam War drove an incumbent president essentially out of office, not running again, President Johnson. The racial divide was as bad as it's ever been. And that didn't mean that we in the military, even though we were in war, were immune from that. So racial tensions in Vietnam among black and white soldiers was very tense. Of course, the armed forces were the first to desegregate and integrate our races, which Harry Truman did, which was obviously the right thing to do, and everybody acknowledges that certainly today, and even back in 1967. But because of what was going on in the United States, it spilled over, it can't help but spill over into all of our institutions, including our military. So certainly we were not segregated in a formal way in Vietnam, but in a practical way, we often were, where African Americans would be in their own tent, the white Americans would be in their own tent. Tensions were very high. After the Tet Offensive in late January, early February 1968, when we had all of our officers either killed or wounded in our battalion, and most all of our senior enlisted. As a private first class, I became the acting company sergeant, and I've been in Vietnam for 2 months. We then got a whole new group of officers, young officers, to take over the battalions and companies and the squads, platoons. And one that we got in our company, Bravo Company, the 2nd of the 47th and 9th Division, was a young African American from Chicago, a 21-year-old by the name of Jerome Johnson. And it was because of him we were able to actually get ourselves put back together as a fighting unit, as Americans. He took some very bold stands and went to the African American tent, went to the white tent, and he said, "This is over. We're not going to do this anymore. We're all Americans. We're all over here together. We're going to support each other, protect each other. We're going to fight together. We're going to live together." And that's it. Now, some of the white guys, their attitude was, "We'll take a young white guy that doesn't know anything. But why are we under the command of a young black kid that doesn't know much?" On the black side of the equation, well, wait a minute. I thought he was on our side. He's an African American. Why isn't he sticking up for us and supporting us with our segregated tents? And so, yeah, there was tension both in the black-white camps here on what Lieutenant Johnson's decision was. But ultimately, it came together. And ultimately, it worked, as these things do work, because we got to work with each other, know each other, laugh with each other, kid with each other, protect each other. And he understood that was going to work, but it ultimately was pretty tough. I mean, he was threatened. In those days, of course, I think anybody who knows anything about Vietnam knows about fragging. about how officers were killed and others. Everybody had loaded guns all the time. Unfortunately, there was a lot of pot going around. Free access to alcohol when you were in base camp. I mean, when you were out on patrol, it was different. In combat, different. But when you were in your base camp, free access, alcohol, whiskey, beer, no restrictions. Technically, there were restrictions, but there weren't. And illegal drugs floating in and out, and the whiff of strong marijuana out of these tents. This was in our military. So the discipline had really broken down. We were a broken army. And Lieutenant Johnson was one of those rare individuals who, I don't know, we got to know him, my brother and I, fairly well. In those days, I mean, there was no real separation between enlisted and officers. I mean, you just all drank beer together and worked together. And my guess at the time was he had no interest in continuing a career in the service. So why was he taking all this risk? I mean, why didn't he just go along and put his time in and get out? Well, my brother Tom and I had often, over many, many years, thought about Jerome Johnson and talked about him, and always wondered what happened to him. We knew he was from Chicago. When I was in the United States Senate, through the Army Liaison Office in the Senate, I asked him if they could try to find him through Army records and so on. Well, they made an effort to do it, but they could never, because he didn't stay in the Army. His name is Johnson, from Chicago. We didn't even know if he went back to Chicago. We didn't know what happened to him. A lot of Johnsons who served in the Army, and a lot of them in Vietnam. So they never found him. So when I became Secretary of Defense, one of the things I learned very quickly is Secretary of Defense can find anybody. So when I called Johnson and we invited him to Washington to come to the Pentagon, he had never been to the Vietnam Veteran Memorial. So my brother Tom and I, we flew Jerome Johnson and Mrs. Johnson and two of their grandsons to Washington. We put them up at the hotels. The tours, Pentagon, and ultimately a private meeting with President Obama in the Oval Office. And it happens that Jerome Johnson's mother just lived a couple of blocks from the Obamas when he was running for the state Senate when President Obama. So we stay in touch, and when I was secretary, I asked him if he would join the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War Commemorative Commission. So he's a member of that. So I'm going to see him, I think, in March, because they have meetings in here every few months. And so when he comes in, we always have dinner and see him. So we stay in touch. His wife and my wife stay in touch. So it was a great reunion. Well, I don't know if it taught me the lesson of we're all human beings, but it reinforced that basic concept that we, I think, generally all subscribe to and agree to. But when it comes to differences of our skin color, our religion, our geography, our political philosophy, then it starts to get a little different. Now, if we're all of the same color and the same religion and the same political philosophy, sure. But we're all human beings, and we all are the same on the inside. And just because somebody's different doesn't mean they're bad. And it just reinforced in me, and I think my brother Tom, that we were brought up like that in Nebraska. And that wasn't new to us. I mean, that wasn't a lesson. But I think one of the lessons that did come out of that, for all of us, certainly my brother Tom and me, that honest, straightforward, strong, steady, wise leadership matters. And all of us who have any responsibility for anything, whether you're a teacher or a parent or whatever, we all have some responsibility. That if you subscribe to those principles and those values, and do always at least try to do the right thing.